3 hours after signing the divorce papers, I boarded a flight to another state with my 2 children. Meanwhile, my ex-wife and her boss's entire family gathered at a clinic awaiting DNA results. But the doctor's answer shattered their happiness before it began. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. And I'm going to tell you exactly how we got to that moment, because this story doesn't start in that clinic, it starts much earlier. It starts with a lie that lasted 4 years. A man who decided to stay quiet while he planned everything, and 2 children who deserved a father who wouldn't give up. My name's Horacio. I'm 46 years old, and this is what really happened. Nobody saw me cry. That was the first thing I decided when I found out the truth almost 8 months ago, that nobody, absolutely nobody, would see me break down, because when a man discovers his wife has been cheating on him for years, he has 2 paths. The first is to explode, to scream, to break things, to lose control, and give her exactly the show she needs to justify everything she did. The second path is harder. It requires swallowing the pain every morning, getting up, going to work, sitting down to dinner with your family as if nothing's wrong, and meanwhile in silence, building the perfect exit. I chose the second path, and I don't regret it. It all started on a Tuesday night, 8 months ago. I'd come home earlier than usual because my boss had canceled a last-minute meeting. It was about 7 in the evening when I came in through the back door, the one that leads to the kitchen, and I heard voices. At first, I thought Graciela was talking to her mom on the phone like she always did, but there was something in her tone, something different, something that made me stop before announcing I was home. I stood still by the ajar door and listened. Graciela's voice was soft, intimate, in a way she hadn't used with me for a long time. She was saying things like, "I missed you today, and I can't wait for Friday." And, yes, the kids are going to be with their grandmother that weekend. Every word was a direct blow to the chest, but I didn't do anything. I didn't go in, I didn't scream. I stood paralyzed for what must have been 3 or 4 minutes, though it felt like a whole hour. When she hung up, I'd already left the way I came in. I got in my car and drove for 2 hours without knowing where I was going. That night, I slept in the car. I didn't want to go into that house. I couldn't look her in the face knowing what I knew and still not having a plan. Because that's how I am. I've never been the type of man who reacts without thinking. I'm the type of man who thinks and thinks and thinks until he has everything clear. And that night, lying back in the driver's seat with the cold seeping through the windows, I asked myself a single question. It wasn't why, or since when, or how could she do this to me? The question was much simpler and much more important. How'd I get out of this without losing my kids? Because that was the only thing that mattered. Andres and Karina. Everything else, the marriage, the house, the years invested, the pain, all of that I could process later. But my children were non-negotiable, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood, that if I didn't move intelligently, Graciela had all the conditions to keep them. She had the stable job. She had her mom Celia nearby. She had Mauricio, her boss, who clearly had money and resources. I was just Horacio, an industrial maintenance technician, with a salary of $2,800 a month and no close family other than my sister Amalia, who lived in another state. But that was what saved me, that Amalia lived in another state. That night, from the car, I wrote her a message. I just said, "I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Don't tell anyone." She replied in less than 5 minutes. "Call me whenever you want. I'm here." And that's how it all began, not with a shout, not with a scene. It began with a text message at 2 in the morning and with a man who decided that if he was going to lose, he wasn't going to lose without putting up the most silent and intelligent fight of his life. What came next took me 8 months. 8 months of acting normal at home, of saying good night and enjoy your meal and how was your day at work. While inside, I was building every piece of the plan. I spoke with a lawyer, Ramon, a friend of Amelia's, a custody specialist. I got a new job in the city where my sister lived with a salary of $3,500 a month and full benefits. I documented everything I could and waited for the exact moment. But there's something I haven't told you yet, something that changes everything, something that has to do with Karina, with Mauricio, and with that envelope the doctor brought to the clinic that morning. That comes later. For now, I need you to understand who Graciela was, because to understand the fall, you first have to see the pedestal from which she believed she was untouchable. Graciela wasn't always like this. Or at least that's what I like to believe sometimes in the moments when I'm still human and allow myself to remember how everything was at the beginning. I met her when we were both 29 at a work gathering I didn't even want to go to. She was standing by the window with a glass of water in her hand, talking to someone. And when she laughed for the first time that night, something in me moved. I don't know how to explain it better than that. Something moved. I approached her. We talked for 3 straight hours, and when I went home that night, I already knew that woman was going to change my life. What I didn't know was in what way. We got married 2 years later. We had Andres first, and then, when Andres was 3, Karina arrived. Those first years were good. Not perfect, because no marriage is, but good. There was love, there were projects, there was a life built with real effort. I work a lot, yes, maybe too much. I left early, came home late, and on weekends I sometimes had emergency shifts at the plant where I worked. I admit it, I wasn't always present in the way I should have been, but never, not a single day, did I stop providing for, caring for, loving that family with everything I had. The change in Graciela began when she got that job with Mauricio about 5 years ago. Mauricio owned an import company. He had money. He had contacts. He had that kind of security that easy money and a comfortable life give you. Graciela started coming home different, with new clothes, with her hair styled differently, with excuses about meetings that ended late and business trips that didn't exist before. I noticed it, of course I noticed it, but I told myself it was the promotion, it was the new responsibility, that it was normal for a woman who was growing professionally to change. I lied to myself for years because it was easier than facing the truth. And then that Tuesday came, that damn Tuesday, when I walked through the kitchen door and heard her soft voice talking to him. And everything I'd lied to myself about for years collapsed in 3 minutes. But what came after that night was even worse, because instead of confronting her immediately, I decided to observe. And what I saw in the following weeks turned my stomach in a way I have no words to describe. I started paying attention to things I used to ignore. The messages on her phone that she deleted right after reading them. The calls she answered in the bathroom with the door locked. The times Mauricio casually came to pick her up to go to a meeting. One Saturday morning, while I was with the kids, I saw it all, and I kept quiet, and I smiled, and I kept acting as if nothing was wrong. One night, Graciela fell asleep on the couch with her phone in her hand. I was sitting next to her, supposedly watching TV. I waited 20 minutes until I was sure she was deeply asleep, and I took the phone. I'm not proud of it, but I did it, and what I found confirmed everything I already knew and revealed something I didn't expect. There were entire conversations with Mauricio, photos, words I'm not going to repeat because there's no need, but there was something else. There was a message from Mauricio that said, verbatim, "If the girl is mine as we believe, we have to talk to a lawyer. I'm not going to let that man keep my daughter." I had to get up from the couch. I went to the bathroom, closed the door, turned on the water so they wouldn't hear me, and I sat on the edge of the tub for a long time. The girl Karina, my 11-year-old girl who was sleeping in her room with her brown teddy bear, they were doubting if she was my daughter. They were planning to take her from me, and Graciela knew it. Graciela was allowing it. That's what broke me inside in a way that the affair alone hadn't managed. Not the betrayal, not the cheating, but that they were willing to tear my daughter away from me. The next morning, I acted exactly the same as always. Good morning, coffee. I took the kids to school. I went to work, but inside I was already a different person because at that moment, sitting on the edge of that tub with the water running, I had made the most important decision of my life. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to confront. I was going to plan. I was going to move so slowly and so silently that when they realized what was happening, it would already be too late to do anything about it. I called Amalia the next day and told her everything. From the beginning to Mauricio's message, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then my sister said something that has stuck with me forever. She told me, "Horacio, if you cry now, you cry, but after today, not one more tear until you have those kids with you and safe. Do you hear me?" I told her yes, and I kept my promise, not one more tear. Amalia connected me with Ramon, her lawyer friend. We met in secret 3 times before I made any other decision. Ramon explained something fundamental to me. He told me that in custody cases, economic stability and the family environment are decisive. He told me that if I could demonstrate a stable job, adequate housing, and a safe environment for the children in another state, I had a real chance of getting primary custody. But he also told me something that chilled my blood. He told me that if Mauricio could prove biological paternity of Karina, he would have legal rights over her. That would complicate everything in a way that could become very long and very expensive. Then I understood that the DNA test wasn't just an emotional doubt for them. It was a legal strategy. They wanted that result to use against me, to take Karina from me with a paper signed by a doctor, and I had to be prepared for any result. So I did something that very few people would have done in my place. I went to a different clinic in another city and got my own DNA test done with Karina before they did theirs. I paid $480 out of my own pocket. I went alone. I didn't tell anyone except Ramon. I waited for the results for 10 days that felt like 10 years. Every morning I'd wake up and watch Karina eating breakfast, and I'd wonder. And I'd hate myself for wondering, because that girl was my daughter in every way that mattered, with or without a piece of paper. But I needed to know, I needed to have that certainty before entering any legal battle. The result arrived one Thursday afternoon in my email. I opened the file sitting in my car in the work parking lot, with hands that weren't shaking because I'd already learned to control that. I read the result and let out the breath I'd been holding for 10 days. Karina was my daughter with a 99.97% probability. Mine, only mine. I saved that document in 3 different places. In my email, on a USB drive I gave to Ramon, and in an email I sent to myself with a copy to Amalia. That paper was my shield, and they didn't know I had it. What came next was building the rest of the plan piece by piece, the new job in Amalia's city, the small but decent apartment she helped me find, the conversations with the kids' teachers to document their academic and emotional situation, every move calculated, every step measured. And Graciela, all that time, was still in her own world, sure that I knew nothing, sure that when the time came she would have all the cards in her hand. But what she didn't know was that I'd been building a hand for 8 months that she would never be able to beat. There's something nobody teaches you about surviving a betrayal in silence. They don't teach you that the hardest part isn't the pain. The pain, you learn to store it, to push it down, to put a lid on it, and keep walking. The hardest part is the acting, getting up every morning and being the same old Horacio. The one who says hello, who makes the coffee, who asks how the kids slept, who tells his wife to have a good day as she walks out the door towards her lover's job. That's what consumes you inside, not the hate, the acting. During those 8 months, I learned things about myself I didn't know. I learned I can smile when I want to cry. I learned I can sit down to dinner across from a person who has destroyed me and pass the bread and ask if they want more water. I learned that silence, when used well, is the most powerful weapon there is. Because while Graciela saw me quiet and calm, while she saw me go to work and come home and say nothing, she interpreted that silence as ignorance, as me not knowing, as me being the fool in the story. And that was what gave me the advantage all that time. But there were moments when I almost broke, moments when the act became too heavy and I felt I couldn't keep it up for one more day. One of those moments was a Saturday night, about 4 months after I started planning everything. Graciela came home late, after 11 at night. I was sitting in the living room watching TV with the volume low so as not to wake the kids. She came in, saw me, and without a word went straight to the bedroom. Not a good night, not a glance, nothing. As if I were a piece of furniture, as if my presence in that house were a minor inconvenience that had to be tolerated. I sat on that couch for an hour after she left, and for the first time in many months, I felt something different from pain and controlled rage. I felt shame, a horrible, irrational shame that made no sense, but it was there, as if the fact that she ignored me so easily said something about my worth. I had to call Amalia that night in a low voice from the bathroom, with the water tap running again, as had become my habit. My sister listened to me, and when I finished talking, she told me something I need you to hear well. She said, "Horacio, The shame you feel tonight isn't yours, it's hers. You're the only one in that house who's acting with dignity. Don't forget it. I didn't forget. That sentence sustained me for the remaining 4 months. Meanwhile, the plan was moving forward. Ramon had been working silently on his end. He explained that to request primary custody of the children, I needed to demonstrate 3 fundamental things. First, that I had a real economic capacity to support them. Second, that I had a stable and safe environment for them to live in. And third, that the current environment at Graciella's house presented elements that could be considered harmful to the minors. That third point was delicate, but Ramon knew exactly how to handle it. The new job I got in Amelia City was the first pillar. It was a larger industrial maintenance company than where I worked, with a formal contract, full benefits, and a salary of $3,500 a month. Amalia had told me about this opportunity a while ago, and when the situation with Graciella exploded, I took it without hesitation. I did the interviews on my days off. I told them I could start in 3 months, and I signed a contract in secret. Nobody at home knew. Not Graciella, not the kids, not anyone. The second pillar was the apartment. Amalia helped me find a small but fully equipped one, near good schools, in a quiet neighborhood. I paid the deposit, and the first month with savings I'd been putting away for years in an account Graciella didn't know about. It wasn't a huge amount, about $4,200 in total, but it was enough to start. Ramon reviewed the lease agreement and told me everything was in order. I already had a place to take my children. The third pillar was the most delicate. Ramon explained that we didn't need to prove Graciella was a bad mother in absolute terms. What we needed to demonstrate was instability in the environment, and the relationship with Mauricio, properly documented, was exactly that. A man outside the family nucleus with a constant presence in the children's lives, without any established legal or emotional bond. Ramon knew how to present it, and I had the records, the dates, the moments that I had documented for months with a notes app on my phone that Graciella never knew existed. But there was something else Ramon had warned me about from the beginning. He had told me that Graciella, if she had a good lawyer on her side, could try to present Mauricio's DNA test as evidence that the family environment was already being disputed, and use that to argue that a sudden move with the children to another state was an unauthorized unilateral act. In other words, if I took the children without a prior court order, she could accuse me of child abduction. That was a huge risk, and Ramon knew it. That's why what he did in the weeks leading up to the divorce was the most important thing of all. He filed for an emergency temporary custody order 3 days before the divorce signing, based on the instability of the environment, my new established job and housing, and the best interests of the minors. The judge studied it and approved it. A signed court order that gave me temporary custody of Andres and Karina while the full process was being resolved. That order was in my pocket the day I signed the divorce papers. Graciella and her lawyer didn't know about it until Ramon presented it on the table right after the last papers were signed. I saw Graciella's face at that moment. I saw how the color drained from her face in less than 2 seconds. I saw how her lawyer took the document and read it with his eyes getting wider and wider. Graciella looked at me for the first time that whole morning, and in that look there was something I'd never seen in her before. Real fear, not the fear of someone who's surprised, the fear of someone who just understood that they underestimated the wrong person. I didn't say anything. I collected my documents, shook Ramon's hand, and walked out of that office. I went straight to the kids' school. I had already spoken with their teachers the week before. I had explained the situation calmly, with documents in hand, and they had cooperated completely. Andres and Karina were waiting for me in the principal's office with their backpacks. I had told them that morning before going to the notary's office that we were going on a trip to visit Aunt Amalia, that it was a surprise. Andres looked at me with that teenage face he has and asked me if I was serious. I told him I was. Karina was already excited since I mentioned it. I got them in the car, put the suitcases in the trunk, and hit the road. I didn't play music, I didn't talk much, I just drove. And as I put miles between my kids and everything we'd left behind, somewhere in the city, Graciella was making frantic calls to her lawyer, and Mauricio, who knew nothing about the court order, was continuing with his original plan. He still thought that that morning in that private clinic where he had summoned his whole family, they were going to receive the result that changed everything in his favor. He still thought he had won, and his entire family, his mother, his brothers, his in-laws, all gathered in that elegant waiting room with machine coffee and leather chairs, all waiting for the confirmation of something that never came the way they expected. But I didn't know that yet while I was driving. They told me later. And when they told me, the only thing I felt was a strange and deep calm, like when a long storm ends and the air suddenly smells different, clean, new, as if the world had just taken a breath. Andres fell asleep with his headphones on about 40 minutes after we left. Karina lasted a bit longer, asking me questions about Aunt Amelia's house, and if there was a park nearby, and if they could have a dog someday. I told her maybe that anything was possible, and I meant it. The highway at night has something that can't be explained well with words. When you drive alone, with your kids asleep in the back and the whole world being left behind, there's also a silence that isn't empty. It's a full silence, full of everything you've lived through, of everything you've endured, of everything you've decided to let go. I drove with both hands on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the white line of the pavement, and for the first time in 8 months, I wasn't thinking about the next step. I wasn't calculating, I wasn't planning, I was just driving. And that, after everything I'd carried, felt like letting go of a weight I didn't know I still had on my shoulders. We'd been on the road for about 2 hours when Karina woke up. I heard her move in the back seat. That little noise kids make when they come out of sleep without fully waking up. She opened her eyes, looked out the window at the passing darkness, and then looked at me in the rearview mirror. Her hair was messy, and her teddy bear was still clutched to her chest. She asked me in a low voice, with that hoarse voice you have when you've just woken up, if we were there yet. I told her a few more hours, that she should sleep, that when she woke up we'd be close. She looked at me for another moment, as if evaluating whether to believe me, and then she closed her eyes again. In less than 2 minutes, she was breathing deeply again. I looked at her in the mirror for a few seconds longer than necessary and thought about that paper, that result with the 99.97% that I kept in 3 different places. About the days I waited for that result with a tight stomach and a racing heart, and I thought that it didn't matter what any paper said. That girl was mine from the first day I held her in my arms. From when she learned to walk holding onto my fingers. From when she called me Dad for the first time with her baby voice, which still couldn't pronounce words well, no paper was going to take her from me. No Mauricio, no clinic, nobody. I kept driving. Andres woke up around the 3rd hour. He did it suddenly, as always, as if someone had flipped a switch. He took off his headphones, stretched in his seat as much as the seatbelt allowed, and looked at me. He had that teenage face that mixes sleep with the natural distrust of 14 years. He asked me directly, without beating around the bush, as he is. He asked me if we were going to live with Aunt Amalia. Not as a scared child's question, as a question from someone who's already adding 2 + 2 and wants to confirm that the result is 4. It took me a moment to answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it right. I told him yes, that we were going to live in the same city as Aunt Amalia, in our own apartment, that I had a new job there, that they would have a new school, new friends, and that everything was going to be okay. There was a silence. Andres looked ahead at the dark road and was quiet for a whole minute. Then he asked me something I didn't expect. He asked me if his mom knew. I told him yes, that everything was arranged legally and that he didn't have to worry about any of that, that it was a grown-up thing and that my job was to make sure he and his sister were okay. Another silence. And then, without looking at me, he said something in a very low voice that has stuck with me forever. He said, "It's okay, Dad." Just that. "It's okay, Dad." And he put his headphones back on. I had to blink several times in a row and concentrate on the road. We arrived in Amelia City after 2 in the morning. She was awake waiting for us with the door open and the porch light on. When I got out of the car and saw her standing in the doorway with that face of my older sister, which has always been the closest thing to a home I know, I felt something let go inside me. I didn't cry. I had promised not to cry, but it was close, very close. She came down the steps, hugged me tight, and said in my ear, "You did it." Nothing more. Nothing more was needed. We carried the kids up, almost because they were asleep again. Amalia had prepared a room for them, with 2 mattresses on the floor and clean, warm blankets. We put them to bed without them fully waking up. Karina let go of her teddy bear for a moment and then hugged it again in her sleep. Andres turned over and faced the wall. We covered them. Amalia turned off the light, and we both went out into the hallway and closed the door carefully. We sat in her small kitchen. She put a coffee in front of me without asking, and we sat for a moment in the silence that only exists between people who've known each other their whole lives and don't need to fill it with words. It was Amalia who spoke first. She asked me how the signing went. I told her everything. Graciella's face when Ramon presented the court order, the silence in that office, the way I left without saying a single word. Amalia listened to me with her elbows on the table and the coffee cup between her hands, nodding slowly. When I finished, she smiled. Not a big smile, a small, quiet smile of genuine satisfaction. She told me, "That's exactly what you deserved." But while I was sitting in that quiet kitchen, hundreds of miles away, the story was taking a completely different turn, one I wasn't seeing, but that had already been in motion for hours because Graciella, after the surprise of the court order, hadn't stayed paralyzed. Graciella was many things, but she wasn't a woman who stood still when she felt she was losing ground. She had called Mauricio immediately. She had told him about the order. She had told him that Horacio had taken the kids. And Mauricio, with that arrogance of man who thinks money solves everything, had told her not to worry, that afternoon at the clinic everything would change, that with the DNA result in hand, they would have enough arguments to reverse any court order, that he had better and more expensive lawyers than anything I could afford. What Mauricio didn't know was that I already had my own results saved in 3 places, sealed, dated, signed by a certified laboratory, and that this result said exactly the opposite of what he expected to hear that afternoon. I didn't know it yet at that moment, sitting in Amelia's kitchen. But while I was drinking that coffee and the exhaustion of 8 months was finally starting to weigh on my bones, in that private clinic on the other side of the country, the waiting room was filling up with people. Mauricio's mother, his 2 brothers, a sister-in-law, a couple of close friends he himself had invited because he was so sure of the result that he wanted witnesses. He wanted everyone to see the moment it was confirmed that he had a daughter. Graciella was sitting among them with a tense, uncomfortable smile because she did have doubts that Mauricio didn't have. She knew things he didn't know, but she had let herself be carried away by the current of his confidence because it was easier than facing the possibility that everything would go wrong. And the doctor hadn't come out with the envelope yet. I finished my coffee. I told Amalia I needed to sleep, that tomorrow we'd start again. She told me the back room was ready for me. I got up, left the cup in the sink, and before turning off the kitchen light, I stood for a moment in the doorway. I thought about everything I had left behind, the house, the years, the life I thought I was going to have. And then I thought about Andres and Karina sleeping in the next room, and I knew I hadn't left behind anything that was worth more than that. I turned off the light, went to sleep, and hundreds of miles away, in a private clinic with leather chairs and machine coffee, the door to the waiting room was about to open. I want you to imagine the scene. Not from my perspective, because I wasn't there. It was told to me later, with details, with pauses, with that way people describe something they witnessed and can't believe was real. They told me, and I listened in silence, reconstructing it in my head as if it were a movie. And every time I remember it, I feel the same thing. Not satisfaction, not joy. Something more like the confirmation that the universe sometimes takes its time, but it doesn't forget. The clinic was private, one of those that have a reception with a marble floor and artificial plants in the corners, and soft music that nobody listens to, but that's there to make everything feel more expensive than it is. Mauricio had chosen it specifically, not just any lab, a clinic with a name, with a reputation, with the kind of atmosphere he liked for everything, the kind of place where you arrive and feel you're on the right side of life. That was important to Mauricio, the appearance, the stage. He didn't just want the result. He wanted the moment. He wanted the whole ceremony. He had arrived at 9 in the morning with his mother, Veronica, a woman of almost 70 who carried her brown leather bag as if it were a shield and who gave her opinion on everything with an authority that no one had given her, but that no one questioned either. They arrived together in his car, a vehicle that cost more than I earned a year. Behind them came his two brothers with their respective wives, and a little later 2 close friends of Mauricio, whom he himself had called the night before to tell them that the next day was going to be an important day, that they should come, that they should accompany him, that they were going to celebrate. Graciela arrived alone 15 minutes after everyone else. She entered the waiting room with her hair up and a blue blouse that I'd seen in her closet but had never seen her wear. She had that expression I knew well, that mix of forced confidence and inner tension that she used when something wasn't completely under her control, but she didn't want it to show. Mauricio stood up when he saw her come in, gave her a kiss on the cheek, and introduced her to those who didn't know her yet, as if she were a newly acquired trophy. Graciela smiled, sat down, and waited. The test had already been done days before. They had taken the samples at that same clinic from both Mauricio and Karina in a previous appointment that Graciela had managed on her own without telling me anything. On one of those days when I was supposedly working and she had taken Karina out of school with an excuse she never told me, I found that out later too, that she had taken my daughter to that clinic without telling me anything, that she had allowed them to take a sample from Karina for a test that could change her life without asking me, without consulting me, without even considering that I had a right to know. That detail, when they told me, was the hardest one for me to process. Not the cheating, not the betrayal, the fact that she had used my daughter as a piece on her chessboard, without thinking twice. But I go back to the clinic, to that waiting room with 10 people who had nothing better to do on a weekday than wait for a result that none of them had the right to expect. Veronica, Mauricio's mother, was the one who talked the most. According to what they told me, she hadn't stopped since she arrived. About the grandchild on the way, about the responsibility that came with it, that she had seen something special in the girl from the beginning, about the eyes, about the chin, that you just know these things. Mauricio listened to her with that convinced man's smile, nodding, letting her talk. The brothers made low-voiced comments among themselves. The sisters-in-law checked their phones, and Graciela was sitting in the middle of all that like someone at a party she's not sure she was really invited to, because Graciela knew something the others didn't. Graciela knew that the dates didn't quite add up, that there was a period of time where the possibility that Karina was mine was real. She had never said it out loud, not to Mauricio, not to her mom Celia, not to anyone. She had buried it under layers of desire and convenience. Because if Karina turned out to be Mauricio's daughter, her position improved in every way, economically, legally, emotionally, in the new life plan she had built in her head. But if she turned out to be mine, that whole plan became complicated in ways she preferred not to think about. So she waited, with a tense smile, with her hands clasped in her lap, with her eyes going to the hallway door every time she heard footsteps. An hour passed, then another. Mauricio ordered more coffee for everyone. Veronica told the same story twice about when Mauricio was a child and was already showing signs of being special. The friends started checking their phones more frequently. The atmosphere in the room gradually changed from anticipated celebration to an uncomfortable wait, the kind that starts to feel longer than it should. It was at 11:40 in the morning when the hallway door opened. The doctor was a man in his 50s, gray hair, white coat, with that professional and neutral expression that you learn to read anyway, because gestures say what the trained face doesn't. He entered with a closed folder in his hand, looked at the group, asked for Mr. Mauricio. Mauricio stood up immediately with that posture of a man who's used to things turning out the way he wants. He extended his hand. The doctor shook it and then, with a completely surgical calm, told him they had the results and that perhaps it would be better to review them in private. Mauricio dismissed it with a wave of his hand. He said there was no problem, that they were family, that he could speak freely. The doctor looked at him for a moment, nodded slightly, opened the folder, and read the result. I was told that the silence that followed was one of those silences you feel physically, as if the air in the room had suddenly become denser, as if everyone present had inhaled at the same time, and no one had yet exhaled. Veronica stopped talking mid-word. The brothers stopped looking at each other. The sisters-in-law looked up from their phones, and Graciela, I was told, remained completely still her hands still clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the doctor, with that expression of someone who somewhere deep inside already knew what was coming but had chosen not to know until there was no other option. The result was negative. Mauricio was not Karina's biological father, with 99.98% certainty. The girl had no genetic link to him. Mauricio read the paper himself after the doctor finished speaking. He read it twice, 3 times, as if the words would change if he looked at them long enough. Then he looked up and looked at Graciela. And according to the person who told me, that look had no love in it, no confusion. It just had a direct and cold question that didn't need words to be asked. Graciela opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and said something that was useless. She said she didn't understand, that there had to be a mistake, that the test had to be repeated. Veronica was the first to stand up. She didn't say anything. At first, she picked up her brown leather bag from the floor with deliberate slowness, like someone who's choosing each movement carefully. Then she looked at Graciela with an expression described to me as the kind of look that makes you want to become invisible. And she told her in a completely calm voice that was more terrifying than if she had shouted, that she had had her doubts from the beginning, but that her son hadn't listened to her, that she hoped the lesson had been worth it, and she headed for the door. One of the brothers followed her without a word. The other stayed for a moment, looked at Mauricio, and told him in a low voice that he'd call him later. The sisters-in-law left almost together. The friend said goodbye with that discomfort of someone who wants to disappear but has to go through the door anyway. In less than 4 minutes, the waiting room that had been full of family and coffee and conversations about grandchildren was left with 3 people. The doctor, who discreetly withdrew to the hallway, Mauricio, and Graciela. And then the second part of the collapse began. Mauricio didn't shout. That was the first thing that surprised me when they told me what happened after everyone left that room. I had imagined him shouting, hitting something, making the scene one would expect from a man like him, used to being in control of everything and having things turn out as he decided. But no, Mauricio remained seated with the closed folder on his lap, his eyes fixed on some point on the marble floor of that expensive clinic he himself had chosen for his moment of triumph. And he was like that for a time that Graciela later told me felt like an eternity. It was she who spoke first, and according to how she was described to me at that moment, she no longer had the tense smile from before. She no longer had the controlled posture of the woman who enters a room and knows how to move in it. She had smeared makeup under her eyes, although no one had seen her cry exactly, as if the sheer weight of what had just happened had undone her face without the need for tears. She told Mauricio they needed to talk, that there was an explanation, that the dates might have been confusing, and that she herself wasn't sure about everything, and to please listen to her. Mauricio looked at her, and with a completely flat voice, without temperature, without any of the emotions one would expect at that moment, he asked her a single thing. He asked her if she had known, if at any point before that day, she had had doubts about the girl's paternity and hadn't told him. Graciela didn't answer immediately, and that 3-second silence was her most honest answer of the whole day. Mauricio nodded slowly, got up. He picked up his phone from the chair next to him and told her something they told me almost word for word because the person in the hallway managed to hear it. He told her that for 4 years he had believed he was building something real, that he had put things into that relationship that he didn't put anywhere else, that he had ignored people who warned him, that he had kept his family away from simpler situations to be available for her, and that all that time she had had a fundamental doubt that she never had the decency to share with him. He told her it wasn't the DNA result that destroyed him. It was that the deliberate silence, the conscious decision not to tell him something that changed everything. Then he picked up the folder from the seat, handed it to the doctor who was waiting discreetly in the hallway, and walked out of the clinic without looking back. Graciela was left alone in that waiting room with leather chairs and soft music that nobody listened to. I was sleeping when all that was happening. I slept until almost 10 in the morning, the first deep and continuous sleep I'd had in months. When I woke up, Amelia's house smelled of fresh coffee and something cooking on the stove. I heard voices in the kitchen. I got up slowly with that heavy body of someone who has just had a real sleep after a long time, and I went to the room where the kids had slept. The door was ajar. There was no one inside. The blankets were folded with that informal fold kids make when they try to make the bed without being taught well. Karina's teddy bear was sitting against the pillow as if it had been carefully arranged. I went to the kitchen. Amalia was standing in front of the stove. Andres was sitting at the table with a glass of juice and his phone in his hand. Karina was in the chair next to him, eating something with that total concentration kids have when they're really hungry. When they saw me come in, they both looked at me. Karina smiled immediately with that smile of hers that always came before words. Andres gave me a nod, that short teenage greeting that in his language means more than it seems. I sat down. Amalia put a coffee in front of me without saying anything, and for a while the four of us were like that in that small kitchen, with the noise of the stove and the morning light coming through the window. Normal, completely normal. And that normality, after everything I'd lived through in recent months, seemed to me the most extraordinary thing in the world. It was later, when the kids went out to Amalia's small backyard, that my sister sat in front of me with her cup of coffee and told me she had received a message. Not from Graciela directly, from Celia, Graciella's mom. Amalia and Celia knew each other for years, from when Graciela and I were a young couple and the families mixed at birthdays and parties. They weren't close friends, but they had each other's number, and Celia had written to her that morning. The message was long. Amalia read it to me out loud with that pause she uses when something seems important to her. Celia said she had spoken with Graciela, that the DNA result had come out negative for Mauricio, that Mauricio had left the clinic and wasn't answering his phones, that his family had cut all contact, and that Graciela was a wreck and needed to talk to her children. I listened without interrupting. When Amalia finished, there was a silence. Then she asked me what I wanted to do. I told her nothing for now, that Ramon had clear instructions on how to handle any attempt at contact during this period, and that any communication related to the children had to go through him, that I wasn't going to answer messages or direct calls, not out of cruelty, but procedure, because Ramon had explained to me that at this moment, any undocumented conversation could complicate the legal process that was underway. Amalia nodded, put away the phone, and told me something else. She told me that in the message Celia also said something about me, that she said that Horacio had always been a good man, and that Graciela had made the biggest mistake of her life, and that she as a mother was ashamed of not having stopped her when there was still time. That did take me by surprise. Not because it changed anything, not because it erased anything that had happened, but because she was the last person I expected to hear something like that from. Celia had always been on her daughter's side in everything and without question. To hear that even she was acknowledging the mistake told me more about the size of the collapse than anything else. But the collapse wasn't over. Its second wave was just beginning, because Mauricio, after leaving the clinic, didn't disappear in silence. Mauricio was the type of man who, when he feels he's been humiliated, needs to transfer that humiliation to someone else. And the closest and most available person to receive that was Graciela. A few hours after leaving the clinic, his lawyer sent her a document. It wasn't a personal letter, it was a legal notification. Mauricio was terminating Graciela's employment contract at his company effective immediately due to internal restructuring, with no additional severance beyond what the law required, no letter of recommendation, no prior conversation. Graciela lost her job the same day, she lost Mauricio, and the same day, she found out I had left with the kids. All on the same day. Celia told me later in a call that Amalia took and summarized for me that same night. Celia was with Graciela in the apartment she had rented 2 months ago, an apartment that Mauricio had helped her pay for in a building 10 minutes from his office, an apartment that now, without the job and without Mauricio, became an immediate financial problem. The rent was $1,400 a month. Graciela had savings for maybe 2 months. After that, there was no plan, and then Graciela made the mistake that Ramon had already anticipated. Desperate, without a job, without Mauricio, without the kids, she tried to call me directly 4 times in less than 2 hours. I didn't answer any. Then she sent me a text message that Ramon asked me not to read and to save as evidence without replying. Then she tried to call Andres' phone. Andres showed me the incoming call without answering and asked me, with that strange calm he had developed since the previous night, what he should do. I told him not to answer for now, that we would soon organize a way for them to talk to their mom in a calm and orderly manner, that it would happen, but first we needed everything to be in its place. Andres put the phone away. He didn't ask any more questions. Karina hadn't asked about her mom yet, or if she had thought about it. She hadn't said it out loud. She was busy exploring Amelia's garden, discovering a stray orange cat that had decided to settle under the back window and negotiating with my sister the possibility of giving it milk. Amalia told her yes, in moderation, and Karina spent the next half hour lying on the grass, trying to win the trust of a cat that didn't know her yet, but with all the patience in the world was letting itself be loved. I watched her from the window and thought that this was exactly what I needed to see. My daughter in a new garden with an orange cat she didn't know, learning that beginnings don't have to be scary, that sometimes life puts you in a different place than you expected, and it turns out that place has green grass and morning light and a cat that eventually lets you pet it. My phone rang. It was Ramon. I answered immediately. He told me there were developments, that the process was moving forward, but there was something else he needed to tell me, something that changed some things in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I prepared to listen. Ramon always spoke with that lawyerly calm of someone who has seen too much for anything to truly faze him. It was a calm that had initially frustrated me a bit. In the first few months, when I was carrying all that weight and needed someone on the other end of the phone to feel the urgency I felt. But over time I learned to value it, because that calm meant he had control of what could be controlled, and in a situation like mine, that was worth more than any emotion. He told me he had received a call from Graciella's lawyer that morning. Not from Graciella directly, from her lawyer. And that already told me something important, because it meant she was still in strategic mode despite everything that had happened that day. She was still thinking in legal terms. She still believed there were moves to be made. Graciella's lawyer had called to inform them that she intended to challenge the temporary custody order that Ramon had filed days before. He argued that the order had been obtained unilaterally, without prior notification to the mother, and that the transfer of the minors to another state without mutual consent constituted a violation of the co-parenting agreement that was still in the process of being formally established. In other words, they were trying to present my departure as an illegal act, as if I were the problem, as if I were the one who had broken something. I listened to everything without interrupting. When Ramon finished, I asked him directly how solid that argument was. He told me that under normal conditions it might have some weight, but in our specific case there were 3 elements that completely neutralized it. First, the court order he had obtained was legitimate, signed by a judge with jurisdiction based on documented evidence of instability in the family environment. It hadn't been obtained irregularly. It had followed the correct process. Second, the transfer of the minors had occurred after the divorce was signed, with the order already in effect, not before. The chronological order mattered, and in this case, it completely favored us. And third, there was something new that Ramon had just received that morning, and that changed the weight of everything else. He told me that the result of the DNA test from the private clinic, the one Graciella had arranged with Mauricio, had been requested as evidence by her lawyer to try to prove that the family environment was complex and disputed. But by presenting it, without realizing it, they had introduced into the legal process a document that officially confirmed that Mauricio was not Karina's father. And that document, combined with the result I had obtained from my own test months earlier, built a very clear picture for the judge, a picture that showed I had acted with foresight, with responsibility, and with the certainty of paternity, while the environment on the mother's side had been embroiled in a dispute over that same issue for months. In other words, they themselves had brought the evidence that helped me into the process. Without realizing it, by wanting to use something against me, they had put on the table exactly what I needed. Ramon told me this in his usual calm voice, and at the end, for the first and only time in all the months we had been working together, I heard something like a smile on the other end of the phone. He just said, "Sometimes people trip over themselves, Horacio. You just have to be in a position to take advantage of the fall." I hung up. I sat in the room Amalia had lent me with the phone in my hand and the afternoon light coming through the window, and I processed everything Ramon had told me with that slowness with which one processes good things, as if the brain needs more time to believe them than to believe the bad ones. But what came after that call was something that didn't come from Ramon or the legal process or any strategic move. It came from a much more personal place, and it was the hardest thing for me to handle of everything that happened that week. That night, after the kids fell asleep, my phone buzzed with a message. It wasn't from Graciela. It was from a number I recognized immediately, although I hadn't received anything from him in months. It was the number of Celia, Graciela's mom. And the message wasn't long. It was 3 lines. It said, "Horacio, I know you don't have to read this, but I need to tell you I'm sorry. I shouldn't have stayed quiet when I knew. I was wrong. I hope the kids are okay." I read it twice, saved it, and didn't reply that night. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't have the right words yet, and I preferred to say nothing than to say something that wasn't exactly what I wanted to say. Celia knew. That's what that message was telling me between the lines. Celia had known at some point something about what was happening with Graciela and Mauricio, and had chosen to keep quiet. I don't know since when, I don't know exactly what she knew, but she knew. And the weight of that had caught up with her that day in a way that had led her to write to an ex-son-in-law at 10 at night to ask for forgiveness. I didn't feel anger towards Celia at that moment. Maybe I should have, but what I felt was something more like sadness, because Celia was an older woman who had lived her whole life putting her daughter above everything, even above what was right, and that day she was paying the price for that misguided loyalty. Alone in an apartment with a broken daughter, without the grandchildren she had had close her whole life, writing late-night messages to someone who had every reason in the world not to answer her. The next day, Ramon informed me of something else. Mauricio had withdrawn any participation in the legal process. Completely. His lawyer had notified that Mr. Mauricio had no intention of claiming any bond or right over the minor, given the result of the DNA test. He was disassociating himself from everything, from Graciela's process, from any related situation, like someone closing a folder and filing it away. As if 4 years of a relationship, and a girl whose paternity he had claimed with such certainty could simply be filed in a folder and put in a drawer. When Ramon told me that, there was a silence on my end. Ramon waited, and then I asked him in a low voice how it was possible for a man to disassociate himself so easily from all that. Ramon told me something I thought about for days. He said that Mauricio had never wanted a daughter. Mauricio had wanted to win. A positive DNA result would have been a victory for him, an argument, a piece of power on a board where he always needed to have more than others. But the negative result freed him from any responsibility, and he used it in exactly that way, not as a loss, as an exit. That told me more about Mauricio than anything else I'd been told. And then I thought about Graciela. I thought about her alone, in that $1,400 a month apartment, without a job, without Mauricio, without the kids with her mom by her side, but without the answer she needed. I thought about all the years we had had, the good and the bad, the person she had been before everything went wrong. And I allowed myself, for the first time since all this began, to feel something that wasn't anger or pain or strategic determination. I felt something more like pity, not for me, for her, for the way she had destroyed her own life, believing she was building something better. That didn't soften me. It didn't change anything I had decided. My children were going to stay with me. The legal process was going to run its course. I was going to build a new life I had planned for 8 months. None of that changed, but it did allow me to close something inside, something that needed to be closed to be able to keep walking without carrying it. That afternoon, Andres looked for me. He came to where I was sitting in the garden, sat next to me on the front steps, and told me he wanted to talk. I nodded, and then he asked me something that took me completely by surprise. He asked if he would ever be able to see his mom. Not with fear, not with anger, with a calm that a 14-year-old boy shouldn't have, but that he had developed in a way that broke my heart and filled me with pride at the same time. I told him yes, absolutely, that his mom loved him, that never changed, and that we were going to find a way for them to be in contact in a calm and organized way, that I was never going to get in the middle of that relationship, that my problem wasn't with him, or with Karina, that they had the right to have their mother in their life, and that was sacred to me. Andres listened to me, nodded, and then did something I didn't expect. He leaned for a moment against my shoulder. That quick, brief contact that teenagers use when they want to say something they don't know how to say with words. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he straightened up, got up, and went into the house as if nothing had happened. I stayed on the steps with the afternoon cooling around me, with the sound of Karina inside, talking to Amalia about the orange cat and if they could give it a name, with the strange and new feeling that exactly this was the beginning of something that was going to be okay. Not the end of something, the beginning. There's one thing people don't understand about long plans. I'm not talking about plans for a week or a month. I'm talking about plans that are built over 8 months, piece by piece, in silence, while life goes on around you as if nothing's happening. People think those plans are cold, that they require turning off emotions, that the person executing them has to become something like a machine to be able to sustain them for so long. But it's not like that. At least it wasn't like that for me. I didn't turn anything off. I carried everything: the pain, the anger, the sadness, the fear, the uncertainty. I carried it all for 8 months. The difference is that I didn't use it as fuel to explode. I used it as fuel to build. And that week, sitting in Amelia City with my kids sleeping in the next room, I began to understand the difference between finishing something and closing it. Finishing something is the physical act, the signature on the paper, the suitcase in the car, the highway at night. That had already happened, but closing it was something else. Closing it was the internal process that has no exact date or precise moment. It's something that just happens slowly, like when a wound stops hurting, not because someone does something, but because the body simply decides to heal. That week was the first real week of the new life, and it was harder than I expected, not for dramatic reasons, but for completely ordinary ones. Because the new life doesn't start with background music and perfect lighting. It starts with practical and sometimes frustrating things. It starts with finding the right school for the kids and filling out forms and explaining the situation without going into too much detail. It starts with learning where the nearest supermarket is and which route to take to get to the new job without getting lost. It starts with Karina asking if she can take her teddy bear on the first day of school, and you telling her yes, of course she can, that nobody's going to say anything. It starts with Andres looking at his phone more than usual and you knowing he's processing things he doesn't know how to tell you yet, but that he'll eventually tell you because he's that kind of person. It starts above all with routine, and routine, after months of constant tension, feels like the greatest luxury in the world. Ramon called me 3 days after the previous call. The legal process was moving forward. The judge had reviewed the challenge filed by Graciella's lawyer and had dismissed it. The temporary custody order remained in effect. Graciela would have the right to communication with the children through supervised video calls twice a week at set times. Any in-person visits would have to be coordinated in advance and approved by the court while the main process continued its course. Ramon explained that the complete process could take another 4 to 8 months, depending on how the hearings developed, but that our position was solid, that the documents were in order, that the history I had built during those 8 months of preparation was exactly the kind of evidence that judges valued in custody cases. I asked him how much all this was still going to cost me. He told me to estimate between $3,800 and $5,500 more dollars, depending on whether Graciela decided to complicate the process with more challenges or if we eventually reached an agreement. I told him that was fine, to keep it in mind that I would cover whatever was necessary. After hanging up, I thought about that number, $5,500. For many people, it's a huge amount. For me at that moment, it represented almost 2 months of my new salary. It wasn't a small amount, but I put it in perspective against what I was protecting, and it immediately stopped seeming large. The first video call between the kids and Graciela was 5 days after our arrival. Ramon had coordinated everything with her lawyer. The call would be at 6 in the evening, would last 30 minutes, and I would be present in the same room, although out of the camera's frame, as the temporary protocol established while the process was still active. I prepared for that moment all day, not because I feared what Graciela might say, but because I wanted to be present in the right way for my children. I wanted them to feel they could talk to their mom without tension, without feeling they were betraying me by loving her. At 6 sharp the call came. Andres answered first with Karina peeking over his shoulder. The screen showed Graciella's face, and I, from my position out of frame, saw her for the first time since the day of the divorce signing. She was different, not in a way that could be easily described, just different, like someone from whom something they'd been carrying for a long time had been taken away, even if that something was an illusion. I didn't hear everything they said. It wasn't my place to listen. I concentrated on the garden visible through the window and let that conversation be theirs. But I did hear Karina laugh at one point, a short, genuine laugh at something Graciela had said to her. And I heard Andres speak with that voice of his that sometimes sounds more adult than it should. And that was enough for me. I didn't need more. When the call ended, Karina came to where I was and told me that Mom was asking how I was. I told her I was fine, to tell her I was fine. Karina nodded with that seriousness of a child who understands more than she says and went to look for the orange cat, which she had already decided to name Naranja with an originality that was completely her own. That night, after they both fell asleep, I sat in Amelia's garden with a cup of cold coffee I had forgotten to drink hot. The sky was clear. It was a bit cold, but not cold enough to go inside. And I allowed myself to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I allowed myself to think about the future without that thought being accompanied by fear or strategic calculation. Just to think, to imagine. I imagined Andres in a few years with that quiet intelligence he has, finding his way in something he doesn't yet know he's passionate about. I imagined Karina growing up with that ability of hers to win the trust of difficult things, be they orange cats or complicated people or scary situations. I imagine the life we could build in this new city, not perfect, not without difficulties, but real, ours built on something solid. And then I thought about everything I had had to go through to get to that garden with that cold coffee, with that clear sky. I thought about the Tuesday I walked through the kitchen door and heard Graciella's voice. I thought about the nights in the bathroom with the water running. I thought about the secret meetings with Ramon, about the clinic where I went alone to get the DNA test and waited 10 days with a tight stomach, about the months of perfect acting, about the morning of the signing with the court order in my pocket, about the highway at night with my kids asleep in the back. And I thought of something Ramon had told me in our first meeting when I was still in the early days of the plan and still didn't know if I was capable of sustaining it. He had told me that in custody cases, judges don't look for the perfect father or mother. They look for the present father or mother, the one who's there, the one who makes decisions even if they're difficult, the one who puts the children first, even if it costs dearly in every possible sense. I had done that. I had put my children first for 8 months, when it would have been much easier to explode, to confront, to give up, or simply accept the defeat that seemed inevitable. I had put them first when I signed that new job contract in secret, when I paid the apartment deposit with my savings, when I took the DNA test alone on a Tuesday afternoon in a clinic 2 hours from home, when I maintained the act every morning, even though it cost me more than anyone will ever know. I had put them first the day I picked up their backpacks and got them in the car and drove down that highway without looking back. And now they were sleeping inside, safe with clean blankets and an orange cat in the garden, and an aunt who made them breakfast, and a dad who was sitting outside with a cold coffee looking at the sky and feeling for the first time in a long time like someone who did the right thing. Not what was easy, the right thing. I went into the house, washed the cup, turned off the kitchen light, went to check on the kids as I did every night since they were babies. Andres was on his back as always. Karina had the teddy bear clutched to her chest and her mouth slightly open, breathing that deep and peaceful sleep that only children who feel safe where they are have. I stood in the doorway of that room for a moment I couldn't measure, and I knew that what lay ahead wasn't going to be simple, that the legal process would have its difficult moments, that the kids would have days where they missed their mom in a way I wouldn't be able to completely remedy, that the new life would demand things I didn't yet know it would demand. But I also knew something else. I knew we had already passed the hardest part, not the paperwork, not the legal process. The hardest part had been the decision not to give up when everything pushed towards giving up. The decision to believe it was worth building something new, even if building it cost exactly everything it cost. I closed the door carefully and went to sleep. 7 months have passed since that night. I sat in Amelia's garden with a cold coffee and looked at the clear sky. 7 months that feel both like very little and a lifetime. Because time does that when you're building something real. It compresses and expands at the same time. The difficult days feel eternal, and the good ones pass too quickly. But when you look back from where you're standing now, what you see isn't a line of suffering. You see a distance, and that distance, measured in everything that changed, is the proof that every step was worth it. The legal process ended 6 weeks ago. The judge granted me primary custody of Andres and Karina. Graciela has a visitation schedule, established with clear dates, with regular communication, with a framework that allows the children to maintain their relationship with her without it interfering with the stability we've built here. Ramon called me when the ruling came out and read it to me in full. I listened to every word, and when he finished, I said, "Thank you." Just that, thank you, because there were no other words that were sufficient for what that man had done for me and my children during all that time. The final cost of the process was $4,900, less than what Ramon had estimated in the worst-case scenario. I paid it in 2 installments. The second part, one paid the same day the ruling came out, as a way of closing that chapter completely and cleanly, with no outstanding debts, no loose ends. Just as I had opened that process, I closed it. Andres turned 15 last month. We had a small dinner for him in the new apartment that no longer feels new, but ours, with Amalia and 2 friends he had made at school in these months. He made that teenage gesture of his, pretending that celebrations don't matter to him, but at some point during the night, he forgets to pretend and laughs for real with a laugh that fills the room. I looked at him in that moment and thought he was okay. Not perfectly okay, because no child who goes through what he went through is perfectly okay overnight, but he was okay in the way that matters, with his feet on the ground, with people around him who loved him, with a future that he doesn't know exactly what shape it will take yet, but that he feels is possible. Karina, for her part, became the most popular person in her class in less than 2 months. I wasn't surprised. She always had that gift, the ability to enter a new place and immediately find the person who most needs to be found and become their friend. Her teacher told me at the first parent-teacher conference that Karina was a child with an emotional intelligence uncommon for her age. I told her yes, that I had noticed it too, and I felt that specific pride you feel when someone from the outside confirms something you already knew about your children, but it's different to hear it said by someone else. The orange cat, which ended up being named Naranja with all the logic in the world according to Karina, eventually settled permanently in Amelia's garden. She bought him a bowl, a small blanket, and put a little house for him under the window. Naranja accepts everything with that quiet dignity of cats who know exactly what they're worth and don't need to prove it. Karina visits him every day after school. It's part of the routine now. And routine, as I learned that first month, is the closest thing to peace that exists in real life. The new job turned out to be better than I expected, not just because of the salary, although the salary helps, but because of the environment, the people, the feeling of arriving at a place where nobody knows who Horacio was before and you can simply be who you are now. There's something liberating in that I hadn't fully anticipated. The anonymity of a new beginning. The possibility of presenting yourself to the world without the weight of everything the previous world knew about you. My boss told me 3 weeks ago that he was considering offering me a supervisory position in the technical area, a raise of $600 a month, and more responsibility. I told him I'd think about it, and as I was thinking about it, I realized that I was thinking about it as someone who has options, as someone who can evaluate a proposal from a place of stability and not from the desperation of someone who needs to cling to what's there. That thought alone, the confirmation that I had reached that place, was answer enough. I told him yes. Graciela and I haven't spoken directly since the day of the divorce signing. All communication has been through the channels established by the legal process. Not out of hatred, but out of the need to maintain clear boundaries while everything's settled. But I know things about her situation through Celia, who eventually replied to the message I sent her weeks after receiving hers. I told her I held no grudges, that what had happened, and that the only thing that mattered to me was that my children were well. Celia replied with a long message that I won't repeat in its entirety, but in which there was an honesty I didn't expect and that I ended up valuing more than I thought I would. I know that Graciela had to leave the $1,400 a month apartment and temporarily move in with her mom. I know she's looking for a new job. I know that the process of rebuilding what she undid will take her time. I don't think about that with satisfaction. I think about it with the distance that time gives when you're no longer in the center of the fire. I think about it as someone who observes the natural consequences of decisions without needing to celebrate or lament them. The consequences are simply what they are. Mauricio disappeared completely from the picture. Neither Graciela nor anyone from that circle has mentioned him again in any relevant way. It's as if he never existed in that story, which, if you think about it, says absolutely everything about the type of person he was. The people who are truly in your life don't disappear when things get complicated. The people who are only there for what they could gain disappear as soon as the balance turns negative. Mauricio disappeared in less than a day. I think a lot about those 8 months now that they're over, not with nostalgia or bitterness. I think of them as one thinks of a difficult training after it's finished, with the awareness that it was necessary, with the recognition that you didn't know you could endure so much until you had to, with the strange gratitude that one sometimes feels toward situations that force you to discover what you're made of. I discovered that I'm made of more than I thought, that I can carry more weight than I thought without breaking, that I can act with intelligence when pain pushes towards an impulsive reaction, that I can plan in silence for months without anyone seeing, that I can be the man my children need, even when I feel I have nothing left. I didn't know that before that Tuesday. That damn Tuesday when I walked through the kitchen door and heard everything. That Tuesday that destroyed one life and unintentionally forced me to build a better one. There are nights when the kids are already asleep, and I stay for a while in the garden of the new apartment. Not Amelia's, ours, small with 3 potted plants that Karina chose at the market and that she waters with a responsibility that no one asked of her, but that she assumed as her own. I sit on the steps and drink the coffee that this time I do drink hot. And I don't think about Graciela, I don't think about Mauricio, I don't think about the clinic or the DNA or the divorce papers or anything that was. I think about tomorrow, about the breakfast I'm going to make, about whether Andres will want me to take him to school, or if he'll prefer to go with his friends, about whether Karina will remember to bring the science homework she left on the table, about small, ordinary things that I would have previously considered too simple to fill a thought and that I now recognize as what they really are. The evidence of a life that works, the proof that I made it to the other side. Sometimes I think about everything I lost, the house, the years, the version of the future I thought I was going to have. And it'd be a lie to say that it doesn't still hurt somewhere. It hurts. Of course it hurts, but it's a different kind of pain than before. It's no longer the pain of someone in the middle of the storm. It's the pain of someone who has already crossed it and looks back from solid ground. That pain doesn't paralyze. That pain teaches. And what all this taught me most, what I take away as the most important lesson of the 46 years I have, and of everything I've lived through in these last few months, is something very simple, that the most powerful revenge has nothing to do with destroying the other. It has to do with building yourself up so well, so solidly, so peacefully, that the other's destruction becomes irrelevant, that you don't need to see them fall, because you're too busy rising, that the best answer to someone who underestimated you isn't to prove anything to them. It's simply to live well, to live with your children, to live with dignity, to live in peace. That's what I do every morning when I get up in this new city, in this apartment of ours, with Naranja meowing in the garden, and Karina already awake before everyone else, and Andres who needs to be called 3 times before he opens his eyes. That's what I do. I get up, make the coffee, call them, and we start the day without resentment, without weight, without looking back more than necessary. Only forward. Always forward.